Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to Mr. Night Whisperer TT. Tonight, I want to take you back to a time when the American frontier was still raw, dangerous, and filled with shadows that stretched far beyond the horizon. This story is about a family who offered shelter, food, and a smile, while quietly perfecting a system of murder that would leave their neighbors horrified and the nation stunned. They became known as the Bloody Benders, a name whispered across Kansas and carried in newspapers from coast to coast. What makes this case so unsettling is not only the coldness of the killings, but also the way it ended, with the family vanishing into thin air, leaving behind graves, unanswered questions, and a haunting silence that still lingers. Tonight, as we step into the prairie winds of Kansas in the early 1870s, I'll guide you slowly into their world, where each small detail seems ordinary until it doesn't. The first time I read about the Benders, I remember pausing at a photograph of the Kansas plains. Endless sky, golden grass, a horizon so flat it felt infinite. It's hard to imagine terror rooted in such openness, yet that isolation was exactly what made the region both alluring and dangerous. In 1870, the U.S. government had opened land in southeastern Kansas for settlement, offering plots to anyone willing to build a life there. Among the settlers were the Benders, a family of 4 who claimed 160 acres near Cherryvale, Kansas. They built a modest one-room cabin and divided it with a canvas curtain. The front half became a kind of inn and grocery stop for weary travelers. The back half was where the family lived. Their place was small but functional. A rough wooden table, a hearth for cooking, shelves with supplies like coffee, flour, and tobacco. To passing strangers, it looked like nothing more than a humble roadside refuge. The family consisted of John Bender, the father, a hulking, silent man in his 60s. His wife, often called Ma Bender, stern and heavyset, with piercing eyes. Their son, John Jr., who was awkward, prone to inappropriate laughter, and rumored to be slow-witted. And Kate Bender, their daughter, young, striking, and known for her charm. Kate introduced herself as a spiritualist and healer, offering seances and herbal remedies. She could speak fluent English, unlike her parents, who mostly used broken German. Together, they cultivated an image of mystery, but also hospitality. Travelers passing along the Osage Trail, an important route through Kansas, often stopped at the Bender Inn. Here they could buy supplies, rest, and enjoy a hot meal before continuing their journey westward. On the surface, it all seemed harmless. But as stories would soon reveal, some of those travelers never made it past the Bender homestead alive. What fascinates me is how the Benders blended into the fabric of frontier life. In that time and place, eccentricity wasn't unusual. Settlers came from all over, bringing languages, customs, and sometimes strange beliefs. The Benders' oddness, Ma's scowling face, John Jr.'s unsettling laughter, Kate's flamboyant talk of spirits, could be brushed off as quirks of immigrant life. People might have whispered, but few suspected the darkness brewing inside that little cabin. And yet, there were signs. Some travelers who stayed at the inn told of a strange heaviness in the air. The way the family sat silently, watching, or how Kate's smile seemed just a little too sharp at the edges. It's one of those unsettling details you only realize in hindsight, that the sense of something being off was real, but impossible to put into words at the time. One fact I find haunting: the Bender homestead was built only a short distance from other settlers' homes. The nearest neighbors weren't miles away. They were within shouting distance. Imagine that for a moment. While families cooked supper, tended animals, and went to bed, murders were taking place just down the road. That contrast between normal life and hidden horror is part of what makes this case so chilling. Historians still debate whether the Benders were truly a family or just criminals posing as one. Some suggest John and Ma weren't married at all, or that Kate was not their daughter, but perhaps their leader. Records were scarce, and people on the frontier could reinvent themselves easily. Whatever their exact relationship, they functioned as a unit, each with a role to play in their scheme. Neighbors remembered Kate in particular. She gave lectures on spiritualism in town, claiming she could speak with the dead. Some were fascinated. Others thought her ideas blasphemous, but her presence gave the family an air of credibility. After all, if she was educated enough to lecture, surely her family couldn't be criminals. Right? As I sit here telling you this story, I picture the inn on a quiet evening in 1871. A fire crackles. A traveler sits at the rough wooden table, spooning stew from a bowl, feeling the exhaustion of the trail lifting from his shoulders. He doesn't know that behind the canvas curtain, a trap has already been prepared. He doesn't know that this will be his final meal. The Bloody Benders had arrived, and though no one could see it yet, a storm was gathering on the Kansas plains. When I think about that little one-room cabin on the plains, it's almost impossible to separate the two sides of it. The front, which offered food, rest, and conversation, and the back, which concealed the darkest secrets. Tonight, I want to take you into that front half, the so-called roadside haven, and show how it became the stage for some of the most unsettling crimes in Kansas history. Travelers along the Osage Trail were always in need of safe places to stop. The trail was busy, carrying settlers, traders, and families westward. The Bender Inn stood in just the right spot, near a natural resting point between towns. That meant steady traffic, hungry, tired, and often alone. The family had a small sign out front advertising supplies and meals, a beacon to anyone weary of the endless prairie wind. Step inside and you'd be greeted by a surprisingly warm sight. Shelves with canned goods, coffee beans in sacks, sugar, flour, bolts of cloth, maybe a barrel or two of whiskey. There was a simple counter where business was done. In the center, the heavy wooden table dominated. Travelers could sit, eat stew or bread, and share conversation. At least that's how it seemed. What nobody knew at the time was that this table had been carefully positioned over a trapdoor in the floor. Behind the curtain, in the living quarters, lay tools, ropes, and what neighbors would later describe as a foul smell clinging to the boards. But in those first moments, all a visitor saw was Kate's smile, John Jr.'s strange attempts at laughter, and Ma or Pa Bender shuffling silently in the background. Kate, in particular, was the face of the operation. She knew how to charm strangers, speaking confidently and often flirtatiously, which was unusual for a woman on the frontier. She'd talk about her abilities as a healer, offer palm readings, or lecture on spiritualism. She had the kind of presence that made people lower their guard. And when she convinced travelers to sit at that table, she was unknowingly setting them up for the last supper of their lives. The process, reconstructed later, was chillingly simple. The victim would be seated at the place of honor, back to the canvas curtain. While they ate, one of the Benders would step behind the curtain with a hammer. At just the right moment, a swift blow would crash down on the back of the head. The stunned or dying victim would be dropped through the trapdoor into the cellar below. From there, their body would be stripped of valuables and disposed of, often in the orchard or garden behind the cabin. The cellar itself, when investigators finally opened it, still reeked of blood. The boards were soaked dark. It's said that even after the cabin was dismantled, the ground beneath retained that smell for years. But in 1871 and 1872, nobody knew this. To most, the Bender place was just one more rough-hewn inn on a lonely trail. Stories of travelers going missing weren't uncommon across the frontier. People drowned, were robbed, or simply vanished into the vastness of the land. That's what made the Benders' system so effective. The prairie itself provided cover for their crimes. What stands out to me is how normalized the whole setting must have felt to their victims. A hot meal after days on horseback, a roof overhead, conversation with people who seemed welcoming enough. Think about how many of us, even today, relax in those moments when we believe we've reached safety. That's when the benders struck. There's a strange fact connected to this era that still fascinates historians. Crime on the frontier was both rampant and invisible. Law enforcement was thin, communication was slow, and communities often handled justice themselves. This lack of structure meant families like the Benders could operate for years before suspicion truly caught up to them. And that's exactly what happened here. But before the disappearances piled up, the inn had an odd reputation. Some settlers avoided it, saying they didn't like the atmosphere. Guests sometimes complained of Ma Bender's hostility. She was said to mutter in German under her breath, glaring at visitors. John Jr., meanwhile, had a laugh that made people uneasy, bursting out at random moments with no real connection to the conversation. These small red flags were brushed aside, dismissed as quirks. In truth, they were warnings. I sometimes wonder how many travelers felt that instinctive prickle of unease when they stepped inside. Did they ignore it, telling themselves they were tired and imagining things? Or did they sit down, thinking only of food, unaware that death was already waiting behind the curtain? The inn was more than just a shelter. It was a carefully constructed hunting ground. And as the Benders perfected their system, guests who never returned home became more and more noticeable to the people of Kansas. Soon, rumors of vanished travelers would become impossible to ignore. There's a rhythm to frontier life that feels almost hypnotic when you read about it. Long days of travel, stops at way stations, the endless monotony of prairie grass and sky. Against that backdrop, the sudden disappearance of a man was often explained away as an accident, a broken wagon wheel, an ambush, maybe even someone choosing to start over under a new name. But by late 1871 and into 1872, the pattern around Cherryvale, Kansas, began to feel different. Too many men seemed to pass along the Osage Trail and never reach their destinations. It started with whispers. Farmers noticed that neighbors who stopped at the Bender place weren't seen again. Families back east wrote letters asking if their loved ones had been spotted. Horses turned up wandering, wagons left untended. And though frontier folk were used to danger, this slow accumulation of vanishings began to weigh heavily. One of the earliest suspected victims was a man named Henry Mackenzie, a well-off settler who'd been traveling alone. He was last seen heading toward Cherryvale, intending to buy supplies. He never returned. Around the same time, a blacksmith named William Pickering reportedly had a close call. He later told friends he left the Bender Inn abruptly after feeling uneasy about how Kate kept urging him to sit at the table's special seat. He trusted his gut and walked out. That decision may have saved his life. Other names began to surface. George Longcore, traveling with his infant daughter Mary Ann, a man named Johnny Boyle, and several others whose details blurred together in town gossip. To locals, it might have seemed like coincidence at first, but as months passed, the unease grew sharper. One particularly strange fact is how the disappearances became more noticeable because of abandoned wagons. On the prairie, a wagon was a lifeline. It carried not just goods, but survival itself. When locals found wagons with no owners, left along trails or in groves, it was deeply suspicious. Horses were sometimes discovered wandering too, but without their masters. It was as if the land was swallowing people whole. There's a scholarly debate I find fascinating here. How much did frontier isolation enable serial killers to thrive undetected? Some historians argue that the sheer vastness of the land, combined with the lack of centralized record-keeping, made it nearly impossible to connect cases. Others push back, saying communities were tightly knit and people noticed when something was wrong. In the case of the Benders, both perspectives seem true. Rumors circulated for months, but actual action lagged behind. Looking back, it's chilling to realize how many people probably stopped at that inn in good faith. We're stopped thinking nothing of it. And yet, neighbors did remember strange things. Some settlers said they saw the Benders digging at odd hours in their garden, though farming life made such activity easy to dismiss. A few claimed to have smelled something foul drifting on the breeze near the property. These were small signs, easy to ignore at the time, but damning in hindsight. Imagine for a moment being a family traveling the trail. You'd be exhausted, vulnerable, maybe carrying your savings and coins hidden in your clothing. You'd stop at the inn because you believed in the hospitality of fellow settlers. You'd let your child sleep near the hearth. And the entire time, the very people serving your meal might already be planning how to strip you of everything you owned, including your life. By 1872, letters from missing men's relatives began arriving in Kansas towns. Questions were asked more forcefully. Why hadn't their sons or brothers returned? Where had they vanished between point A and point B? The trail always seemed to lead near Cherryvale. The tension in the community was rising, though no one could yet prove what was happening. The Benders, meanwhile, kept on as though nothing were amiss. Kate still lectured on spiritualism, John Jr. still laughed at inappropriate moments, and travelers kept stopping by. It was only a matter of time before one particular disappearance would ignite a full investigation and bring suspicion crashing down on the quiet inn along the Prairie Road. But before that, the list of vanished souls would continue to grow, their names lost to time, their fates sealed beneath the Kansas soil. What finally began to push the community from whispers into open suspicion was not just the growing list of missing men, but the objects they left behind. On the prairie, nothing was wasted. A wagon, a horse, even a well-made pair of boots. These were lifelines. When such things were found abandoned, it set off alarms in a way words alone could not. It started small. A stray horse, ribs showing from days without feed, was found grazing near a creek. It bore a saddle, but no rider. Locals asked questions. Whose horse was it? Why had it been left? Then came wagons. One in particular stood out, a sturdy covered wagon discovered sitting empty near Drum Creek, not far from the Bender property. Inside were personal belongings, tools, bedding, even a family Bible. The owner was nowhere to be found. The pattern was unmistakable. It wasn't just one man lost to the dangers of the prairie. It was multiple men, all traveling along the Osage Trail, all vanishing within a narrow stretch of land. And somehow, their animals and wagons were turning up without them. For settlers, this was a frightening escalation. A lone rider gone missing could be explained away by river crossings, storms, or outlaw ambushes. But wagons abandoned? That was different. Wagons meant stability. They meant family, supplies, permanence. People didn't just walk away from them. One particularly strange case involved a man named Johnny Boyle. He'd been traveling with a wagon loaded with household goods, chairs, tools, and crates, clearly intended to start a new life somewhere west. When Boyle failed to reach his destination, his family sent word back, and neighbors confirmed he'd last been seen near Cherryvale. Weeks later, his wagon was found in a thicket, horses dead of neglect. The belongings were intact. Boyle himself had vanished. The discovery spread fear across the community. It was as if the prairie had become a mouth, swallowing men whole while spitting out their possessions. And still, the Benders carried on. Their small inn remained open. Kate continued to advertise her healing sessions, even claiming she could locate missing people through spiritual means. Some settlers trusted her, even confiding their worries about relatives who hadn't come home. Looking back, the cruelty of that performance is staggering. Kate may have been hearing details about her victims directly from grieving families, all while knowing exactly where their bodies lay. I sometimes pause here to reflect on the nature of suspicion in small communities. People often sense something is wrong long before they have proof. A neighbor seen digging at odd hours, a foul smell on the wind, the laughter of John Jr. echoing strangely. These are the kinds of details that lodge in memory only after the truth comes out. At the time, people brush them off, telling themselves not to imagine monsters where none exist. There's an unsettling scholarly debate about how much ordinary settlers knew or allowed themselves to know. Some argue that neighbors suspected the Benders long before the official investigation, but fear of being wrong or of accusing without evidence kept them silent. Others believe the Benders were skilled at masking their crimes, blending into frontier life just enough to keep suspicion at bay. What we do know is that the abandoned wagons marked a turning point. They transformed rumor into tangible evidence. Horses might stray, but wagons stayed where they were left, mute witnesses to something terrible. The sheriff of Labette County began quietly taking notice. Reports were gathered. Families filed claims of missing loved ones. And all trails seemed to bend back toward one point on the map, the stretch of land where the Bender family kept their inn. It's eerie to imagine how the Benders reacted as the pressure grew. Did they sense the net closing in? Did they hear the murmurs in town? Or did they believe, even then, that their system was foolproof, that the prairie would cover for them forever? What's certain is that the abandoned wagons lit the first real spark of official suspicion. And soon, a disappearance far too important to ignore would fan that spark into open flame. Before we move into that next chapter, I'll pause here to remind you. If you're finding yourself drawn deeper into this story, make sure to stay connected with us. Hit the like button if you want more cases that disturb your thoughts just enough to linger, and subscribe so you don't miss the next unsettling tale. And while you're listening, drop a note in the comments. Tell me what part of the world you're in and what time the clock reads for you right now. It always amazes me how these stories find listeners across different time zones, each of us awake with the same unease. By the spring of 1873, the unease that had been rippling quietly through southeastern Kansas erupted into real alarm with the disappearance of a man who could not simply be written off as another drifter. His name was Dr. William York, a respected physician, a Civil War veteran, and, most importantly, a man with family connections powerful enough to demand answers. Dr. York had been traveling through Labette County in March, following up on the case of a woman and child who had reportedly vanished along the Osage Trail months earlier. He was diligent, curious, and perhaps too trusting for his own good. When his horse returned without him, local suspicions turned into open fear. Here was not just another nameless settler gone missing. This was a doctor, known and respected, tied to two brothers with political influence. Those brothers were no ordinary men. One was Colonel Edward York, a prominent figure in Kansas. The other Senator Alexander York, a state legislator. The moment word reached them that William had vanished, the tone of the investigation shifted. This wasn't just a community mystery anymore. It was a matter of honor, politics, and family. Colonel York personally rode into Labette County to investigate. Imagine that scene. A stern, battle-hardened man arriving in a small frontier town, asking pointed questions, his presence impossible to ignore. He demanded to know who had last seen his brother. The answers kept circling back to one place, the Bender Inn. When Colonel York visited the Benders, he was received with unsettling politeness. Kate, ever the smooth talker, assured him that many travelers passed their way, and they couldn't be expected to know what had become of each one. She even offered to use her spiritual gifts to help locate the doctor. Some witnesses later recalled that John Jr. laughed during the visit, an eerie, out-of-place sound that only deepened York's suspicions. But the colonel had no proof, yet. All he had were rumors, and the knowledge that his brother had ridden that trail and never emerged. Still, his questions stirred the county. Families who had quietly accepted their loved ones' vanishings now spoke up more openly, and York's determination gave those whispers weight. Here's a chilling fact that unsettled me when I first came across it. During his questioning, Colonel York reportedly confronted the Benders directly about the rumors that they were involved in disappearances. Kate, without hesitation, dismissed the accusations as slander. Some accounts suggest she even grew angry, accusing York of insulting her family's honor. It was a bold performance, and for the moment, it worked. The colonel left without hard evidence. Yet, he wasn't done. He promised he would return, and he did, bringing with him more men and sharper questions. The Benders must have sensed the shift. For the first time, their carefully maintained facade was cracking. Their system relied on anonymity, on the assumption that no one powerful would come looking for their victims. With Dr. York's disappearance, that illusion was shattered. From an academic angle, this moment is fascinating. Many scholars debate whether the Benders would ever have been discovered if not for William York. Some argue they could have operated for years longer, preying on nameless travelers, had they not crossed paths with a man whose family could and would raise hell. Others believe the community was already close to exposing them, that the missing wagons and lingering suspicions had built too much pressure. Either way, York's disappearance was the catalyst that forced hidden truths into the open. I can't help but imagine the atmosphere in the Bender cabin during those last weeks. Did Ma and Pa argue with Kate about whether to flee? Did John Jr. laugh nervously as tension mounted? Or did they, in some twisted confidence, believe they could still talk their way out of it? The truth would reveal itself soon enough. For the moment, though, the Benders carried on, pretending to run a simple inn, while the shadow of William York's absence loomed larger and larger. The community was watching. The colonel was circling back, and the bloody garden behind the inn was waiting to give up its secrets. When Colonel York returned a second time to the Bender property in late spring of 1873, he was no longer a lone investigator searching for a missing brother. He arrived with an armed posse, neighbors, concerned settlers, and local authorities, all determined to find answers. His questions had grown sharper, his patience shorter. The Benders once again greeted him with their well-rehearsed civility. Kate, poised as ever, tried to calm the colonel by offering her psychic services, even hinting she might communicate with his missing brother from beyond the grave. It was a bold, unsettling move, but this time, York was not in the mood for her theatrics. Witnesses claimed he directly accused them of harboring dark secrets. The tension inside that cramped cabin must have been unbearable. Imagine a low-ceilinged room, the air thick with suspicion, Colonel York's hand resting on the butt of his pistol, and the Bender family standing just a little too still. If the colonel had forced the matter that day, searched the property thoroughly, the story might have ended differently. But for reasons still debated, he held back. Perhaps he lacked a legal warrant. Perhaps he wanted undeniable proof before acting. Perhaps the community wasn't yet ready to believe the worst. And then, suddenly, before anyone could act, the Benders vanished. Not just Kate, not just John Jr., the entire family disappeared almost overnight. Neighbors reported the inn shuttered, the animals wandering the property unfed, the garden neglected. At first, some thought they had simply left for better opportunities elsewhere. But others knew. Families like the Benders didn't just abandon their homes without notice. Something darker was at play. It was the neighbors, not the authorities, who finally entered the cabin after days of silence. What they found was grotesque. The first clue came when they lifted the trapdoor in the cabin floor. Beneath it lay a shallow, blood-soaked pit. The stench of decay hung heavy in the air. Some claimed the floorboards were so saturated with blood that it had seeped into the soil. The discovery was only the beginning. A search of the property led investigators to the family's garden and orchard. There, buried in shallow graves, lay the missing travelers. Body after body was unearthed. Some were found with their skulls crushed and throats slit, a grisly signature of the killer's method. Among them was Dr. William York. The community's horror deepened with each corpse exhumed. Entire families were uncovered, men, women, even children, slaughtered and discarded like unwanted livestock. Estimates vary, but official reports listed at least 11 bodies. Some later accounts inflated that number to 20 or more. A strange fact stands out here. The bodies were buried so close to the surface that in some cases, the tips of boots or strands of hair were visible through the soil. It suggests the Benders weren't concerned about careful concealment. Maybe they didn't believe anyone would ever come looking, or maybe they felt untouchable in their isolation. Either way, it paints a picture of killers brazen in their cruelty. The scholarly debate that lingers is whether the Benders acted purely out of greed, robbing their victims of money, horses, and supplies, or if something deeper drove their killings. Some historians argue their methods were too ritualistic, too theatrical to be explained by robbery alone. The trapdoor, the seating arrangement, the hidden hammer, all suggest premeditated performance, almost like a ritual act. Others dismiss this, pointing to the very real cash and goods stolen from travelers, framing the Benders as opportunistic predators who cloaked their crimes in frontier hospitality. For me, the truth may lie somewhere between. Perhaps they began as robbers, but as the killings piled up, murder became more than necessity. It became habit, even pleasure. What cannot be debated is this. The Bender homestead was no longer just an inn on the prairie. It was a killing ground. A place where strangers were lured with food and conversation, only to be dispatched with a hammer's blow and discarded in shallow earth. And the Benders themselves? Gone. Vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind their bloody orchard and a town steeped in rage and fear. The hunt for America's first family of serial killers was about to begin. The discovery of the Benders' bloody orchard spread like wildfire across Kansas. News reached as far as St. Louis, Chicago, and New York. For a nation still reeling from the Civil War, the tale of an entire family running an inn of horrors on the open prairie was almost too shocking to believe. Yet the bodies in the ground made disbelief impossible. Local settlers were outraged. Many had passed through that inn, eaten at that table, even shaken hands with the Benders. To realize they had sat inches from the very trapdoor that led to a blood pit, it was unbearable. Fear turned to fury. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Where were the Benders now? Possés were organized quickly. Armed groups scoured the countryside, following any trail that might lead to the fugitive family. Bloodhounds were brought in, though the prairie winds scattered scents quickly. Some claimed to have seen the Benders boarding a train in nearby towns. Others insisted they fled by wagon, disappearing into the endless grasslands. The official story was this. The Benders abandoned their property by wagon, traveling north. Their tracks were followed as far as Chanute, Kansas, before splitting in two directions. Some said Ma and Pa went one way, Kate and John Jr. another, hoping to confuse their pursuers. But no posse ever captured them. A strange fact emerges here. A Bible was found inside the abandoned cabin, scrawled with notes and underlined passages, some of them apocalyptic in tone. One margin note reportedly read, "Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord." Scholars have debated whether this suggests the Benders saw their killings as justified, even divinely sanctioned. Others believe it was simply a grotesque irony that murderers left behind scripture as if mocking their victims. The debate about their escape is just as tangled. Some historians argue that vigilante justice may have quietly ended the story. According to one rumor, a posse caught up with the family and lynched them in secret, choosing silence over the bureaucracy of trials. Another version claims only Kate and John Jr. were captured and killed, while Ma and Pa slipped away. Still others say none of them were ever found, and they scattered to different states, blending into immigrant communities where their names and accents would not stand out. What adds to the mystery is that bounty hunters kept claiming rewards for capturing or killing the Benders well into the late 19th century. Dozens of people were accused of being the fugitives, and even into the early 20th century, elderly women were occasionally identified as Kate Bender and dragged into court. None were ever conclusively proven. For scholars, this creates an ongoing puzzle. How could an entire family, known by sight to hundreds of neighbors, simply vanish without a trace? Some suggest they had help, that sympathetic settlers or criminal allies gave them shelter during their escape. Others propose they never fled at all, but were quietly executed and buried by the very vigilantes who claimed to be searching for them. Standing on that abandoned property, the neighbors must have felt the uncanny silence pressed down on them. The once bustling inn, with its clattering dishes and passing travelers, was now a house of horrors, emptied of both its residents and its secrets. The prairie winds blew over the orchard, rustling leaves above shallow graves, while somewhere, perhaps a mile away, perhaps across the country, the Benders breathed free air. For the victims' families, the unanswered question of justice would fester. There were no trials, no verdicts, no confessions, only graves and rumors. And for America, the Bloody Benders became a legend, half history and half folklore, a reminder that beneath the promise of the frontier lurked horrors as brutal as any city crime. The chase was far from over, but with every day that passed, the trail grew colder and the shadows of the Kansas prairie grew longer. By the summer of 1873, the Benders were ghosts on the prairie. Lawmen, bounty hunters, and furious settlers kept chasing rumors, but nothing tangible ever surfaced. Still, the legend of the family killers continued to grow, spreading beyond Kansas, morphing into something larger than the crime itself. Newspapers of the time had a field day. Some described Kate Bender as a dark sorceress, blending her reputation as a supposed spiritualist with lurid tales of seduction and murder. Others painted Ma Bender as the iron will of the family, driving her son and husband to violence. There was even speculation that John Jr. wasn't really the son at all, but perhaps Kate's secret lover, an incestuous rumor that made headlines despite no hard evidence. This is where the story begins to blur between fact and folklore. What we know is that 4 people ran the inn. What was written about them afterward, however, sometimes reads more like dime novel fiction than hard reality. And yet, these exaggerations fueled public fear and fascination. One unsettling detail that remained consistent in the accounts was the method of murder. Every version of the story agreed. Victims were seated at the place of honor, at the dinner table, encouraged to relax and enjoy their meal. Behind them, hidden by a curtain, stood one of the Benders with a hammer or mallet. The blow came quick, and the victim's throat was then cut before the body was dropped through the trapdoor. It was this chilling uniformity, this methodical precision that haunted people. These were not impulsive killings. They were systematic. And the number of victims? That's where things become murkier. Officially, at least 11 bodies were recovered around the orchard, but townsfolk whispered of many more. Travelers had vanished in droves during those years. Some scholars suggest the Benders may have killed as few as a dozen. Others believe the true count could have exceeded 20 or even 30. This sparks one of the great debates among criminologists. Can we classify the Benders as America's first serial killer family? Or were they simply opportunistic murderers, preying on wealthy travelers for profit? The distinction matters because it shapes how we interpret their psychology. A serial killer family implies a shared compulsion, a dark unity in violence. Murder for profit suggests cold pragmatism, a gruesome business venture. An unusual fact often overlooked. Among the possessions found buried with the victims were personal items like pocket watches, eyeglasses, and even a small Bible belonging to one traveler. These weren't melted down or sold. They were simply tossed into shallow graves with the corpses. Some historians argue this detail suggests carelessness, or perhaps a twisted ritualistic element. The Benders discarding not just lives, but identities, burying memory itself. In the months following the discovery, neighbors couldn't shake the eerie sense that the Benders were still near. Strange sights were reported. A shadowy figure moving along the tree line at dusk, a wagon creaking across the prairie at night, voices carried by the wind. Most were likely the byproducts of fear and imagination, but they kept the community on edge. As the search widened beyond Kansas, the family's legend hardened. Wanted posters appeared across the Midwest. Rewards were offered. A few unlucky German immigrants were even beaten or nearly lynched by mobs who thought they resembled the fugitives. The line between justice and hysteria grew dangerously thin. One thing becomes clear when looking back. The frontier justice system wasn't built to handle crimes of this scale. A murder or two, maybe, but an entire family orchestrating a slaughterhouse of travelers? It was unprecedented. That's why the Benders weren't just a Kansas story. They became a national one, reshaping how Americans thought about safety, strangers, and the lawless edge of settlement. By now, the case had moved beyond graves and suspects. It had entered the realm of legend. And legends have a way of refusing to stay buried, just like the bodies in that orchard. The years that followed brought more confusion than clarity. Every so often, reports surfaced claiming the Benders had been captured. Each time, the authorities investigated. Each time, the trail went cold. In 1889, 2 women were arrested in Michigan, accused of being Ma and Kate Bender. They were held for weeks, paraded before witnesses from Kansas. Some swore it was them. Others weren't so sure. In the end, the evidence fell apart, and the women were released. Yet the story filled newspapers, reigniting the public's fascination with the Kansas fiends. What strikes me is how quickly myth wrapped itself around the case. Even respected journalists began writing about the Benders as if they were something other than human. Creatures of evil, not people. Some described them as demons in disguise. Others claimed they practiced witchcraft, pointing to Kate's seances and her public talks about spiritual healing. By the 1880s, the family wasn't just remembered as killers. They had become America's bogeymen. Still, the victims' families never forgot the human cost. Think of George Newton Longcore, who had only been trying to start a new life with his baby daughter. Or Dr. William York, who left behind a grieving family and a community that admired him. Each grave in that orchard was a story cut short. And the fact that no one stood trial for those deaths, no confession, no justice, made the pain linger even sharper. Here's a strange fact that rarely makes it into the headlines. When the cabin was dismantled after the discovery, neighbors noticed that the boards of the floor had been scrubbed so often that the wood was warped and worn thin. It was as if blood had seeped deep into the grain, refusing to leave, and the Benders kept scouring it in vain. That detail, scrubbed but stained, became almost symbolic. No matter how much the frontier wanted to wash away the horror, the memory would not vanish. Scholars today still debate whether the family escaped or whether vigilantes caught them. Some argue that frontier justice almost certainly ensured their deaths. The evidence? Silence. If they had truly lived, surely one of them would have slipped up, been arrested for another crime, or been recognized in a new town. Yet, others counter that the sheer mobility of the era, trains, wagons, immigrant communities, made it possible for them to vanish entirely, new names and all. This raises an important point in criminology. What makes a killer legend endure? Is it the brutality of the acts, the mystery of the escape, or the way a community responds with whispers and myths? The Benders seem to embody all three. Unlike Jesse James or Billy the Kid, they weren't celebrated outlaws. They were remembered with dread. Unlike Jack the Ripper, their identities were known, yet they were still untouchable. That paradox keeps their story alive even today. In Kansas, the old site of the inn became a place people avoided. Travelers spoke of unease when passing the orchard, even after the cabin was gone. Some refused to camp nearby, saying the ground itself felt cursed. Whether from superstition or memory, the land carried a weight. Meanwhile, the state of Kansas continued to receive letters and inquiries for decades, people swearing they had spotted Kate or John Jr. in some far-off town. Each lead was checked, none ever confirmed. The case file grew thicker, but not clearer. By the turn of the century, the Benders were no longer just fugitives. They had become folklore, names whispered around campfires, subjects of dime novels and lectures. Parents warned their children about strangers on the road, invoking the Benders as the ultimate warning. Beware who you trust, even those who smile and offer you food. And so the mystery endured, not because it was solved, but because it wasn't. By the early 1900s, the Bloody Benders had already become woven into the cultural fabric of the American frontier. Newspapers called them the Fiends of Kansas. Traveling lecturers retold the story to gasping audiences. And in the absence of resolution, every town seemed eager to add its own chapter. But beneath the tall tales, fragments of truth still surfaced. In 1910, yet another woman was arrested in Oklahoma, accused of being Kate Bender. She was dragged into court, her face scrutinized by aging settlers who swore they remembered the young woman from the 1870s. But decades had passed. Memory is fickle. Faces blur with time. Once again, the charges collapsed. The woman walked free, and the Bender mystery deepened. What fascinated criminologists was the way the case lingered. Normally, unsolved crimes fade into obscurity, eclipsed by newer tragedies. But the Benders refused to fade. Their case lived on, not just in Kansas, but nationwide. That persistence speaks to something primal, our fear of predators hiding in plain sight. One haunting fact: when lawmen inventoried the items left behind in the inn, they found books, stationery, and children's toys. These weren't for the Benders. They belonged to travelers who had vanished. Yet, rather than pawn them, the family kept them. Scholars argue about why. Some say it was laziness, others a grotesque trophy collection. But it suggests the victims lingered in that cabin, even after death, through their possessions. There's another scholarly debate worth mentioning. Some historians argue that the Benders were not a family in the traditional sense at all. Documents from the period show conflicting records of their origins, their relationships, even their names. It's possible that Ma and Pa were not husband and wife, that Kate and John Jr. were not siblings. If that's true, then the Benders weren't a family bound by blood, but rather a group of criminals bound by necessity and opportunity. That interpretation reframes the story. Less about a twisted family unit, more about opportunistic killers who constructed a false identity to mask their crimes. On the ground in Kansas, though, the reality was simpler. People still remembered neighbors who never came home. Families left without fathers, brothers, or sons. The graves dug up in that orchard told the truth more clearly than any court ever did. Even as the years stretched on, the Bender cabin remained a source of fascination. Visitors to the area collected fragments of wood or stones, relics of America's House of Horrors. It became a strange sort of dark tourism site, decades before the term existed. And always, the same uneasy question hovered. If the Benders survived, where did they go? Did they live out their lives quietly under false names, perhaps even with new families of their own? Did they carry the memory of the orchard with them every day? Or did they erase it as thoroughly as they erased their victims? The legend had transformed the family into shadows, slipping between fact and rumor. What no one could deny, however, was the lasting impact. The Bloody Benders had shown America that danger did not always wear the mask of an outlaw in the street. Sometimes it smiled across a dinner table, pouring you soup, asking where you were headed. As the decades rolled forward, the search for the Benders slipped further into the realm of folklore. Yet the killings were not forgotten. They lingered in the minds of historians, criminologists, and Kansas locals who continued to revisit the case like a wound that refused to heal. By the 1920s, frontier America was gone, replaced with automobiles and paved roads, but the whispers remained. Every few years, some farmer's field would yield a bone and speculation would reignite. Was this another victim of the Benders? Forensic science was still in its infancy, making definitive answers rare. Most often, the bones turned out to be animal remains, but the paranoia persisted. There's a peculiar fact here. In 1923, a journalist uncovered what he claimed was a confession from a dying man in Colorado who said he had been part of the vigilante posse that captured and executed the Benders. According to his story, the family was hanged and buried secretly, their graves unmarked, to keep the law from interfering. This claim could never be verified, but it became part of the folklore, cited in countless retellings. Some scholars believe it, others dismiss it as a tall tale spun by a man seeking attention in his final days. And this tension between documented history and oral legend has always haunted the case. Were the Benders cunning fugitives who slipped away into anonymity? Or did the very neighbors who hunted for justice quietly take it into their own hands? What fascinates criminologists today is the collective psychology of the region. The Benders' crimes weren't just murders. They attacked the very sense of safety settlers needed to survive. Out on the prairie, trust was currency. You relied on strangers for shelter, for food, for news. The Benders turned that trust into a weapon. That betrayal cut deeper than any hammer or knife. A debate among academics continues. Should we classify the Benders as early organized crime? After all, their operation was systematic, with each family member playing a role. Pa and John Jr. maintained the farm. Ma cooked and hosted. Kate charmed and lured victims. It wasn't chaos. It was structured, almost businesslike. Yet, unlike later organized crime syndicates, the Benders lacked networks, bribes, or broader influence. They were an isolated pocket of violence, self-contained and brutal. By the 1930s, the site of the orchard had become little more than farmland. The cabin was long gone, dismantled plank by plank. But travelers still visited, asking locals to point out the exact spot where the inn once stood. Some would leave with stones, others with scraps of soil. And while the place changed, the unease clung to it. Farmers said their horses shied away from certain patches of earth, as if the land itself remembered. I often think of that when considering how crimes outlive their perpetrators. The Benders may have vanished, but the orchard remained. It bore silent witness to the suffering, long after the family who caused it disappeared into dust or rumor. And so the case stood, a blend of history and myth, of graves and whispers, stretching far beyond Kansas, until the Benders became not just America's nightmare, but a symbol of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary facades. By mid-century, the Bloody Benders were less a fresh crime and more a ghost story rooted in American folklore. But every so often, the case resurfaced in headlines as if the prairie itself refused to let it fade away. In 1934, a curious report emerged. A pair of elderly sisters in Texas were accused of being Ma and Kate Bender. Local officials, eager to solve an old mystery, had them transported to Kansas for questioning. Crowds gathered, hoping for a revelation. But once again, witness testimony proved shaky. Decades had clouded memories. The sisters were released, their names cleared, though whispers followed them until their deaths. These periodic accusations reveal something unsettling. The Benders were never allowed to die in the public imagination. For nearly 70 years, any woman with a sharp face and a German accent risked being labeled as Kate. It shows how unresolved crimes can echo across generations, shaping how communities view strangers and outsiders. One eerie fact is worth pausing on. In 1937, while plowing near the old site, a farmer claimed his blade turned up a rusted knife and bone fragments. He insisted it was human, though experts disagreed. Still, the rumor spread like wildfire, convincing locals that new victims remained buried. Whether true or not, the land never stopped whispering. This brings us to a larger scholarly debate. How do societies handle crimes that resist closure? Some argue the persistence of the Benders legend is a form of collective processing, a way for Kansas to externalize its fear and guilt. Others suggest it's simpler. Americans are drawn to the grotesque, and a family of killers in the heartland was too strange to forget. There's also the question of classification. If the Benders truly murdered over a dozen people, should they be considered America's first serial killers? Or does their organized family-based operation make them something different? Perhaps the nation's first known team of serial killers. Criminologists argue both sides, but what remains clear is that the case influenced how future crimes were understood and categorized. By the 1940s, the Benders were featured in crime anthologies, pulp magazines, and even school lectures on frontier history. The image of a welcoming inn hiding a death trap beneath its floor became iconic. It wasn't just history anymore, it was a cautionary tale. Still, no official answers ever surfaced. No grave for the killers, no confession, no definitive capture. Just rumors, arrests, and endless speculation. And as each decade passed, the line between fact and legend blurred further, until the Benders lived on not as people, but as phantoms of American crime. By the 1960s and 70s, America had entered the age of modern true crime. Jack the Ripper, Lizzie Borden, and H.H. Holmes were discussed in books and classrooms. The Bloody Benders stood among them, their story retold in documentaries, magazines, and even roadside attractions. What had once been local tragedy had now become part of the national crime canon. But the fascination never softened the horror. Standing back, it's remarkable how much of the case remains a blank space. No trial, no definitive capture, just the certainty of bodies in the ground and killers who slipped through history's fingers. In 1961, a researcher at the Kansas Historical Society uncovered letters from descendants of Dr. William York's family. In them, the Yorks expressed bitter frustration that justice had never been served. Nearly 90 years had passed, and yet for them, the wound still felt fresh. Their ancestor had been butchered, and his killers never faced a courtroom. It was a reminder that unsolved crimes don't simply fade, they imprint themselves on families, sometimes for generations. Here's a strange fact. By the 1970s, the state of Kansas considered turning the old Bender site into a memorial park. Local farmers resisted, fearing the land would become a circus of gawkers and thrill-seekers. The plan was quietly abandoned. Even in death, the Benders had power over the living. Academics during this period debated whether the Benders should be considered a rare case of familial psychopathy. Typically, serial killing is solitary, sometimes involving a pair. But a whole family working together? That was almost unheard of. Some argued that Kate's supposed charisma and interest in spiritualism acted as the psychological glue, binding the others into compliance. Others believed Ma was the true matriarch of violence, driving her husband and children into the crimes. The lack of trial records leaves this forever speculative, but the debates still echo in criminology classrooms today. Meanwhile, folklore continued to twist the narrative. Local storytellers added flourishes, Victims screaming as they fell through the trapdoor, Kate laughing as she poured tea, Pa silently dragging corpses across the floorboards. These details may never have happened, but they became inseparable from the legend. That's what happens when crimes escape resolution. Imagination fills the void. The deeper tragedy, of course, is that the victims became secondary characters in their own story. Their names were often forgotten while the Benders' names endured. This imbalance between notoriety and remembrance remains a problem in true crime even today. And so, 100 years after the killings, the orchard was just farmland, the cabin long gone, and the Benders either dead or living under false names in unmarked graves. Yet the story refused to rest. It had become an echo, passed down through books, lectures, and ghostly whispers on the prairie wind. By the 1980s and 90s, the legend of the Bloody Benders had become a staple of American true crime. Writers packaged the tale alongside the exploits of other frontier killers, blending fact and folklore into a chilling portrait of lawlessness on the prairie. The Benders were no longer just a family of innkeepers. They had become archetypes of evil, symbols of how the American frontier could turn dark. Television documentaries began to dramatize their crimes. Viewers watched reenactments of travelers lured in with promises of a hot meal, only to be struck down by Pa's hammer. The trapdoor creaked open under studio lighting. Kate's eyes glimmered with sinister charm. It was entertainment, but it kept the memory alive. A strange fact, in 1992, a Kansas psychic claimed she had visions of the Benders' unmarked graves. She led journalists and volunteers to dig sites near Cherryvale. Nothing was found, but the media coverage reignited interest in the case. Some said the search itself showed how desperate people still were for closure, even more than a century after the killings. The academic conversation, however, shifted from psychology to sociology. Criminologists began asking, how could an entire community have ignored the warning signs? After all, dozens of travelers vanished, and neighbors admitted they were suspicious of the Benders long before the York investigation. Scholars debated whether denial, fear, or sheer indifference allowed the murders to continue unchecked. Some suggested that frontier isolation made people turn inward, unwilling to interfere in each other's business, even when lives were at stake. Others went further, arguing that the Benders thrived precisely because of the frontier myth. That out there, everyone was responsible for themselves, and asking too many questions was dangerous. In that sense, the family's crimes were not an anomaly, but a dark extension of the environment in which they lived. As the 21st century approached, the Bloody Benders were firmly entrenched in America's true crime canon. Ghost tours in Kansas mentioned them. College lectures dissected them. And amateur historians scoured archives, still hoping to find the final thread that would reveal what became of the family after 1873. But no such thread appeared. The trail remained broken, the answers forever out of reach. And perhaps that's why the story endures, because mysteries that deny resolution are the ones that never let go. Now, sitting here in the quiet telling you this story, I'm reminded of how the Bloody Benders tale refuses to fade away. It lingers not only because of the brutality of the crimes, but because of what came after. The vanishing act, the lack of closure, the silence where answers should be. By the early 2000s, the Benders had become almost mythological. Local ghost tours in Kansas described the prairie as haunted ground, where travelers could still hear the echo of wagon wheels or the creak of a trapdoor. True crime authors continued to revisit the case, weaving old newspaper clippings with folklore. And yet every book, every documentary ended the same way. The killers were never found. That is the real chill of the Benders' story. It's not just the hammer blows or the graves beneath the apple trees. It's the empty space left in history, the fact that no one knows where the family went, how they lived afterward, or if they ever faced justice. Did Kate continue her seances under a different name? Did Pa and Ma live out their days quietly on some distant farm? Or did they, as some whispered, take new lives and new victims somewhere else? The silence is its own kind of horror. Here's one last strange fact. In 2016, modern genealogists attempted to trace DNA from the victims' descendants in hopes of cross-referencing old bones found in the area. No match was ever made, but the attempt showed how technology continues to chase ghosts from the past. Even now, science bends toward the orchard, hoping to illuminate what time has buried. Scholars continue to debate what the Bender case really says about human nature. Some see it as an outlier, a bizarre family unit twisted by circumstance. Others view it as proof that when isolation, secrecy, and unchecked violence converge, almost anything is possible. The academic debate is unlikely to end, because the primary sources are gone, the witnesses long dead, and the family's final fate locked away in mystery. And so, the story remains unfinished. A family of innkeepers who murdered travelers, a prairie orchard hiding shallow graves, a town relieved to see them gone, but left forever wondering what became of them. That is the legacy of the Bloody Benders, a crime without resolution, a wound without healing. History, like the prairie, sometimes swallows things whole. And in the silence that follows, legends are born.